Hey everybody, welcome once again to a live stream conversation with the Alliance for Natural Health, and I'm really thrilled to have you all joining us today, whether you're joining us live on Facebook or YouTube in this country or abroad. We're really thrilled to have you here today. If you're like me, you have sort of those go-to publications that you look at just to stay informed on what's going on. And every once in a while, I'm sure one of those things catches your attention, right? You see a headline and you go, wait a second, I got to know what that's about. Well, I had one of those moments a little over a week ago. I regularly read and tune into Intelligent Medicine with the good Dr. Ronald Hoffman. And he had posted something on his blog that really caught my attention. And the title was Medical Nihilism Has Its Time Come. Now, for me, this was a really compelling headline because at the time I was reading I tend to like Russian literature. And I was reading Ivan Turgenev's book. It's an anti-nihilist novel. It's probably the quintessential anti-nihilist novel, called Fathers and Sons. And I've always been fascinated with the concept of nihilism. Back in college, like many people, I got infatuated with the works of Nietzsche and some others, and, all of its offshoots, whether it be Ayn Rand or whomever. But nihilism's always kind of fascinated me. Eventually it sort of burned itself out in my own philosophical development, but I am always fascinated. And when that name comes up, when that word comes up, that philosophy, it sort of draws my attention. So I had to know, what does it mean to be medically nihilistic? So I am going to bring in our first guest today and the author that I have been speaking about. Welcome, Dr. Hoffman. We're thrilled to have you here today.
Well, thanks very much for having me. If you're a fan of Russian...
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
If you're a fan of Russian literature, one of the problems with nihilism is that you get, as in Dostoevsky's novel Crime and Punishment, you get Karamazov, who believes that no laws apply, right, and he commits a heinous murder. So, hopefully we're not talking about that type of nihilism. Let's not implicate Russian literature into this discussion.
No, absolutely. And that's what caught my attention. So what does it mean if we practice nihilism within medicine? I mean, it sort of opens up a veritable can of worms. So would you care to explain to me and to all of the folks that are watching us, what is meant by that term?
Well, first, would you like to introduce Rob into the discussion? Rob Furkert,
let's go ahead and International. And I'll introduce both of these guys just in case anybody doesn't know. So, Dr. Hoffman, as I mentioned, he's our medical director for one thing, which we're always thrilled to rely on his medical advice. He also, and I encourage you to tune in or subscribe to Intelligent Medicine, but he's got a radio show up in Manhattan. He has a weekly newsletter that goes out, and it's full of great information like medical nihilism. And I'm sure we all know the one and only Dr. Robert Verkerk, who is our scientific director. He's the founder of ANH. He's the executive director of ANH International. So welcome as well, Rob.
Thank you so much indeed, Tim. And I only have one problem.
Medicine and science together today, and so what could possibly go wrong? We have an MD and a PhD.
That we pronounce nihilism differently. Like vitamin
great.
And vitamin, but now we've swapped round, and I'm going to call it nihilism, and you're going to call it nihilism. But if we refer to vitamins, I will say vitamin, you will say vitamin. And let's not bring the tomato.
You say tomato, I say tomato.
Yeah.
Okay.
I remember we all participated in a documentary I made a couple of years ago, and one of the key components of that was a substance called aluminum, or as Rob would say,
aluminium.
So anyway, so back to medical nihilism. Ron, do you care to extrapolate?
Sure. This is all based on my reading of a fascinating book entitled Medical Nihilism or Medical Nihilism by a Cambridge professor named Dr. Jacob Stiganga. And he's a lecturer at Cambridge University across the pond. And he wrote a book which is premised. By the way, he is a philosopher, and what he attempts to do is apply philosophic reasoning to the study of science and medicine. And he if you really do a deep dive on this, medicine is not really science. It's kind of a medical science is kind of an oxymoron. The notion that we apply strict scientific rigor to medical enterprises is erroneous. It turns out that medicine is influenced by many things. It's influenced by politics. It's influenced by the profit motive. It's influenced by vogues. And so the term medical nihilism means that we apply a certain level of skepticism to medical developments. So, for example, stateside, we have the expression, I'm from Missouri. It's the show me state. The license plate says, show me. And what that means is that folks in Missouri are kind of skeptical. They don't take anything for granted. And unfortunately, in medicine, there's sort of a headlong rush to make advances and to introduce new techniques. And what Stegenga says is that some of the methods by which we vet our medical therapies are thoroughly unscientific in terms of pure scientific reasoning. And he critiques our methodology in doing that. However, he does say, to those who would label me anti-science, he replies, medical nihilism is not the audacious view that there are no effective medical interventions. It's just that we have to take a skeptical perspective towards them.
So, Rob, let me bring you into this. That's really interesting. I've never really thought about medicine as not scientifically based. That's an interesting proposition that you raised. Rob, as a scientist, do you concur with Dr. Hoffman? I think we have you on mute right now.
Yeah, there we go. We unmute it. Look, I think there is an overlap. It's a little like a Venn diagram. I think there are very interesting differences in the training that us PhD scientists have compared with an MD. I have the fortune of having followed my own son's education through Cambridge University into medicine. He's now a surgeon. And it was very interesting that many of the proper sort of methodologies that we would regard as important in science, which are really around experimental design, statistical power, statistical methods, sample sizes, randomization, all these kind of processes that really allow you to determine if studies are what we might call high quality, are not a big part of an MD's education. And so the thing that always staggers me, I see so many doctors drawing conclusions from abstracts, whereas us PhDs, we pretty much discount the abstract and we go into the paper. We can only get an abstract. It's really not worth reading because, that's often been written by the university, by PR people, by the funding bodies. It frequently, particularly when you're looking at drug trials, does not really accurately reflect the results of the study. So, yes, there is an overlap. And I also know many MDs who become pretty good scientists. And I also know many PhDs who become good clinicians. So, it can work both ways around. But medicine is definitely an art. It is also a philosophy. I think that's why, if you go back to Hippocrates and Socrates, it is really worth, and Aristotle, any of these great Greek physicians and philosophers, they were touching on something that was really important about the art of clinical practice, about putting the patient at the center of decision making, but also using the scientific method. And right in the middle of the scientific method is this important need to be skeptical. You have to not know what the outcome of any trial is going to be. And you have to always deal with uncertainty. And, you know, this is a fascinating juncture in human history, because my sense is, you know, medical nihilism or nihilism, we're all going to try and pronounce it the other way around, you know, could be in some respects a good thing, in the sense that if we recognize that some of the medicine, including, say, the most commonly prescribed drugs on the planet, don't do a lot of good because there isn't a lot of good science to support them, that does not mean that medicine itself isn't good. So, you know, by recognizing the flaws of the existing paradigm that's taken us, particularly in this recent juncture when organic chemistry has become the dominant player in how medicine is done, and it's produced this huge plethora of patented medicines, it's time for a rethink. And we now got the interplay of genetic sequencing, gene editing, and synthetic biology overlaying that. My goodness, we need a shakeup. So we, you know, Stegenga's book and philosophy and approach is really, it's one of the first sort of rational attempts to say, look what Marsha Angel was saying, look what Peter Gotcha was saying, people who've written highly critical books coming from very high level places on the inside to say, guys, there's something wrong. And it needs someone who's come from a different discipline, from philosophy and history, as Stegenga does, to say, guys, there really is something wrong. Time for a major review about how we do healthcare.
And I'll provide the quote from the former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, who kind of quit because she was disillusioned. Dr. Marsha Angel wrote, quote, "It is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines." That's a pretty remarkable statement from someone who emerged from the belly of the beast, so to speak. You know, really, she was, you know, front and center as a spokesperson for conventional medicine.
And Ron, Peter Gotcha's book, you know, Deadly Medicine and Organized Crime, sort of says it on the cover. And he comes from the inside of the PhD, the scientific end of the system, Cochrane. He was a co-founder of Cochrane.
Right.
So can we look? So let's look at, for a minute, at a specific example. So I know in the book, he spends a lot of time talking specifically about RCTs. So, you know, currently a random clinical controlled study is the gold standard method, right, by which all of these things are judged. So what's at the heart of this? What is the issue with RCTs? Because that seems to be, you know, have the big bullseye on it. And what are the alternatives? I mean, we have to study this stuff somehow. So if the way we're studying it is wrong, how do we do it better? I'll open that up.
So randomized controlled trials are considered, quote, the gold standard of medicine. And you have a placebo group and you have an active group that is taking the medication, or in some cases the supplement, because there are studies about nutritional supplements. And what you have is often you stack the deck because there are ways to introduce bias. There's also what's called publication bias. Is if a study doesn't prove that a drug is beneficial, it can get deep sixed. It can get not published. You can also torture the data. You know, statistics. You know, I think it was Mark Twain who once said, "There are lies, damn lies, and statistics." And statistics can be manipulated to achieve a result, especially if there's a profit motive involved, where a drug might or might not be approved. So there's a lot of ways that this can go wrong. Also, you know, in terms of your selection of a target group, you might take young, robust, healthy volunteers for a study that proves that something is beneficial. And then you apply it to a population of elderly, frail individuals and find that the drug in question is killing people. So there's a lot of problems with the RCT model. And, Stigenga points this out from a philosophical standpoint, that there may be some better methodologies to help us achieve our goal, which is to provide us with safe and effective medications.
So when you talk about better methods, Rob, as a scientist, as somebody who does this for a living, what are those better methods? I mean, is it a matter of cleaning up how we conduct RCTs, or is it time to just shift the paradigm completely and go in a different route?
Well, look, let's first, from a sort of scientific point of view, let's understand how RCTs develop gold standard status. They do it because, from a statistical point of view, if you have control over all the variables of all of the subjects in the different arms of the trial, you have what is termed a very high level of internal validation. So what that means is that when you do a statistical analysis on the results, you can get a situation where, a very small percentage of effect, say if you had a control group that had a 2% risk of hip fractures, and then in your control and then in your treatment arm, you used a drug that reduced the number of falls that elderly people had, and it went to 1%, while 1 and 2% really make no difference to the population as a whole, that 1% difference is likely to be statistically significant. So it actually, when you say it actually has a high level of internal validation, what it means is it works very well for small effects. In other words, for drug companies that have really developed and refined the approach as a technique to get through the hurdles of pharmaceutical licensing. And what it measures, and this is not well understood by the public, what it measures is a thing that we call efficacy, which is often mistaken for effectiveness. And of course, what happens in the real world is that different populations are subjected to a whole battery of different variables, different environments, different diets, different amount of care they get from a health professional, different social pressures, pollutants in the air, you name it, different levels of physical exercise. So all these variables come in. Now, this is one of the important reasons why when you see a headline in a newspaper that talks about this new cancer drug that shows a 30% improvement or a 50% improvement, first of all, you've got to understand from where. Is it like the 1 to 2% scenario that I just described that will be described by the drug companies as a 50% improvement that makes no real difference? Now, does that effect also occur in the real world? And, very often it does not. Very often it does not. So in the real world, and moving to what we could do instead is this idea of measuring effectiveness rather than efficacy, accepting the fact from a statistical point of view, we're going to have a lot more noise in the system. But my goodness, if you start to then see effects, you are getting really robust effects that can, if you like, rise above the noise. So the kind of approach that we're moving towards in that regard is moving towards pragmatic trials, observational studies. So you can do, say, a prospective observational study where you are looking at what a long-term study that might run over 10, 20, 30 years to see what the outcomes are, predetermined outcomes, measuring specific biomarkers or other outcome measures, health over a long term. But of course, we're now seeing the influence of digital systems of data recording and this idea of developing big data sets. And this is where you're looking at huge populations that can all be stratified and segmented. And yes, it's noisy data, but if you start to see effects there, they tend to be really quite robust effects. In other words, they affect a very wide range of people, pretty much regardless of their greatly differing lifestyles, nutrition, environments, etc.
You know, a
So
useful
there's a continuum
concept
between these two ideas.
A useful concept is something called NNT, number needed to treat. And this is a good way sometimes of really explaining to clinicians who are going to be deploying these medications and the public who's going to be accepting and using these medications of the true value of medications. And it turns out that, you know, say in the instance of something which improves bone density by 50%, you have to apply an NNT, a number needed to treat statistical analysis sometimes to really understand what that means. And what that may mean is that you may have to treat 50 or 100 people for 5 years with the potential for side effects in order to reduce one fracture, for example, or with statin drugs. People who take it preventively because they have high cholesterol, they don't have pre-existing cardiovascular disease, you'd have to treat 100 people for 5 years to reduce one heart attack. That's the number needed to treat. And then there's another statistic, it's called NNH, numbers needed to harm. And sometimes when you compare the number needed to treat, the number needed to harm, they fairly closely align. So it means that you know, you'll get a slight benefit, but you also may introduce a slight or a significant harm that may outweigh the benefit in terms of the risk calculus. So you know, these are concepts that Stiganga tries to uphold. You know, the other boogeyman, according to Stiganga, is what are called meta-analyses. And meta-analyses are also thought to be high up on the hierarchy of evidence. And what they do is they're studies of studies. So if you have, you know, one study, sometimes you have issues that are contradictory, like is coffee good for you, is coffee bad for you, or eggs good for you, or are eggs bad for you? So they do a meta-analysis, and the meta-analysis may look at 50 studies, and they grade them in terms of the scientific rigor of the studies, and they come out with a weighted average that either, you know, that resolves the question. Yes, coffee is good for you. Yes, eggs are good or bad for you, whatever the outcome is. But the meta-analysis is notoriously subject to bias and manipulation. And so you have to, you know, have your medical nihilism helmet on when you take a look at some of these studies, because, you know, there's a lot of people who have an agenda, a narrative. And, you know, the studies will sometimes corroborate a narrative. Otherwise, why undertake an elaborate, expensive study? And it's either to promote a drug or promote a philosophy, you know, of a low animal protein diet is more beneficial. You know, these are examples of meta-analyses gone awry.
Well,
yeah. Can I just add to that? That of course, what you do in a meta-analysis is you are really mixing apples, oranges, and often pears and grapes and, you know, bananas. So you're throwing them into a washing machine, and you often, even though there will tend to be attempts to, in the inclusion studies for the randomized controlled trials, to sort of eliminate variation, you're still getting surprisingly large amounts of variation. But essentially it is a way of just putting a whole bunch of data to get a bigger number. And for example, the meta-analyses done on, say, carbohydrate diets have skewed against high meat consumption. If you look at the Pure study, for example, because the American unhealthy, highly processed meat eaters happen to be the biggest meat eaters in the world, and then it also skews against high carbohydrate diets when it's primarily focusing then on Chinese studies, because the poorest people in China, who are very large in number, are basically consuming large amounts of rice and very little else. So the research tends to suggest out of this that there is a sweet spot in the middle in terms of carbohydrate consumption that is, if you like, is just an artifact of the two extremes that really don't give us valuable data on high quality meat eating, say from pasture raised animals versus, the same kind of, you only need to look at the Okinawans who have 85% of their diet as carbohydrates. And they're some of the healthiest, most long-lived, least chronically diseased populations of the world, to know that, we have data to suggest it isn't the carbohydrate that's causing the problem, it's the quality of diet that's causing the problem.
So let's turn to sort of what's pressing on everybody's minds right now, because we're talking about this extreme skepticism that we're referring to as medical nihilism. And right now we are, and I think this is true all over the world. It's not just in the United States, but certainly here in the United States, we're in two really, really separated camps, right? And both sides are extremely skeptical of everything they hear from the other side. I think we all can agree with that. I don't think that's a debatable position. So my question is, first, when you face something like a global pandemic, how do you get something to market? I mean, we've talked about big data. We've talked about all of these different ways to address the problem. And how do we avoid the pitfall of becoming so skeptical of everything that we don't agree with that we can't move anywhere? Because I mean, the problem that I ran into in college with nihilism is it leads to nowhere, right? If there are no authorities, if there are no boundaries, if there are no laws, what are you left with? Nothing. You're left with anarchy. And certainly I think an argument could be made that right now politically, we're in anarchy. We're in a place where nobody gets along with anybody. Everybody who questions vaccines is anti-vax. Everybody who doesn't is, anti-science. And, and listening to Rob, your explanation about the dietary studies, it seems like we need to be skeptical of both sides of that equation. And that the truth, as you said, is somewhere in the sweet spot. So I asked the question, when we look at something like research and the next pandemic that comes along, what would be the right answer to that question? How do we both fill the need for an expedited something that can fix the problem, the magic bullet, as the author talks about, or is that just not even achievable at this point?
I'll just mention that Stiganga may be providing an intellectual foundation for people who challenge vaccines because of nihilism or medical skepticism, but it declares that he is not an anti-vaxxer. He's merely after, full disclosure, and also, he makes the point that the vast majority of drugs and/or vaccines are approved on the basis of limited, relatively short duration trials, which show a benefit, but in what's called post-marketing, which means it's unleashed on the general populace, seldom are drugs or vaccines as effective and safe as they were touted in the original studies. So I think that that's the perspective to take, is that, we want to make a risk-benefit analysis on virtually all the therapies that we opt for and make intelligent choices about which ones to onboard. Yeah,
look, I agree. The problem is these political, scientific industrial complex that we face. I'll just read out a small quote here from Cameron Abbasi, who's executive editor of the BMJ, again, one of the leading world's leading medical journals. And what he does is essentially rail against the politicization and corruption and suppression of science around COVID-19. So talking to Tim's very point is, what we've seen. I'll just read out a section. He says, politicians and governments are suppressing science. They do so in the public interest, they say, to accelerate availability of diagnostics and treatments. They do so to support innovation, to bring products to the market at unprecedented speed. Both of these reasons are partly plausible. The greatest deceptions are founded in a grain of truth, but the underlying behavior is troubling. And he then goes on to tear apart what has actually happened in terms of the suppression of science, the breaking down of all the safeguards that have been in place for the last 40 years to try and ensure that only safe drugs are brought to market. You know, if you like, you have a whole series of additional benefits that the pharmaceutical and the vaccine industry have benefited from. They've had public funding at an unprecedented scale. They've had their liability covered by the taxpayer. So, I mean, what a way to circumvent what is normally a 6-year plus process, get your product to market. And exactly as Ron has just been indicating, we now start to see a pattern of adverse events in emerging post-marketing surveillance data that is really quite at odds with the very limited phase 3 data that we saw prior to emergency use authorizations being granted. And you know, I think it is a massive wake-up call that we need to rethink how this has all happened. And I believe that, you know, the very fact that we are nowhere near getting to a place where, for example, ivermectin and other nutritional protocols can be seen alongside vaccines, both for prophylaxis, for COVID-19 prevention, and for early and late treatment, is a major you know, stumbling block in terms of good science being practiced and good medicine being practiced, with the public potentially being denied really important, really cheap, really cost-effective treatments. And of course, from a regulatory standpoint, the reasons that governments will not allow that is because the entire foundation of emergency use authorization is that there are no viable alternatives. So they have to suppress anything that looks like it might give it a good run for its money.
So again, we come back. I think this becomes a recurring theme, and you know, I don't. It's not just drug companies. It's you know, I've been looking at the history of cell phone safety. Interestingly enough, I've been doing a little video series on that, and it's interesting. You know, back in the 1980s, cell phones came onto the market, zero safety testing, right? About 1993, somebody developed cancer, and suddenly there was this spate of research that came out, almost all of it funded by whom? Of course, telecoms industry. But even that wasn't enough. The telecoms industry, you know, the person in charge of that project actually came to the conclusions, you know what, these things cause brain cancer. And then the industry did this whole PR thing where they threw a bunch of studies at it and tried to suppress the data. And here we are decades later. You know, back then, 6% of people use cell phones. Now, all of us use cell phones, even little kids. I see little kids in restaurants on their cell phones with their thinner skull, you know, and so we reach these places, and it seems like this plays over and over again: tobacco, cell phones, drugs, and always it's about this convolution of the truth. You know, there's something being suppressed that raises questions about a very financially important industry, and somehow that data gets pushed to the side, and the data that serves the financial interest of that industry seems to come to the fore. So it seems to me that the issue that we face across all of these industries with all of these different health concerns is the playing field. It's not level. And the question I have is, how do we level the playing field? And obviously, having a bit of skepticism about what is being is essential to that, right? And to creating that political or that level playing field. So, any thoughts on, you know, as we're sort of beginning the wrap up here, how do we level the playing field? How do we get it to a place where something like ivermectin is going to be studied with the same seriousness as, you know, the Pfizer vaccine?
You know, I think we need to, you know, and Stegenga actually points this out. You know, at the end, you know, he's been he chapter after chapter, he knocks down the premises of modern medical orthodoxy and medical research. And so at the end of several chapters, what's left? Should we just go back to the Stone Age? And he, in place of that, he suggests that we return to what he terms gentle medicine. And I'm quoting, it's a therapeutic approach that relies less on heroic high-tech interventions and more on lifestyle modification with diet, exercise, and social measures that improve personal well-being. And he invokes Sir William Osler, who's considered the father of modern medicine, who is famed for saying, this is a great quote, "One of the first duties of the physician is to educate the masses not to take medicine." And that was written, I guess, in the 1890s or something, or 1880s. And boy, have things changed in the last century or so, because doctors are enthusiastic adopters of medication, and they don't really act as consumer advocates safeguarding their patients from the ravages of the marketplace, which essentially it is. It's a marketplace, a competitive marketplace, where there's a lot of options. So we need to reinstill. First of all, I recommend that every medical student, every practicing physician, every person involved in health policy, every professor and educator, who has contact with medical personnel, nurses, etc., that they grab a copy of Medical Nihilism and take it in, even if they don't agree with it, because we need to have a little more, less buy-in, shall we say, to the very, very aggressive marketing of medical procedures and techniques.
Let me throw my my whatever it is, 6 dimes or something into the ring here. I think the system is so deeply broken and corrupted at the upper levels that the solution lies with the grassroots. And frankly, it's one of the reasons that we're all involved with the Alliance for Natural Health, because we are an alliance of interests who really care very deeply about the future of humanity. And we also recognize that human beings are of nature, from nature. And, it's a fascinating juncture now that we see this view from technocrats and many of the people who are leading the charge at the moment, particularly since the pandemic crisis, if I can use that term, hit, is that we see a fusion between technology and human beings and the development of transhumans. And so I think we kind of need to first of all, wake up to that reality. Secondly, I think we need to empower the grassroots with information. And there is nothing, if you look at all of the great teachings and philosophers in medicine, and Stegenga joins those ranks, with Aristotle and others, they all say something very similar, that medicine is there to do good, and the experience that individuals have is above all what is important. I mean, most of us make decisions about what we're going to do because of what people are doing around us. We are sheep to some degree. The doctor as God model, where the doctor sat there and prescribed a given medication, and the patient sat as a kind of victim of whatever decision that the doctor chose at that time and that place. That went on for a long time in the Western world, much less common in the Eastern world. But that's now a thing of the past. And what's fascinating about what's happened in the last year or so is, of course, it's now a sort of political, economic structure controlled by mainstream media and social media platforms that determines most people's health decisions. So if we can empower people with data about experience, and that there is a hugely rapid development of digital platforms that allow people to measure health. And we're involved in a couple of projects in that area that are eye-opening in terms of the quality of data that can be received and how that maps out. If those data are taken from very large numbers of people, you can start to then get people who start making sensible choices that are their own, that are determined by true, properly informed medical consent. And whether it's in self-care, whether it's in what we call guided care. And of course, we need to also fundamentally change the model of healthcare. What we call healthcare is actually nothing more than a disease management system. So we're actually in the Western world not very good at doing healthcare. Healthcare starts preconception. It occurs throughout an individual's life. It should be all about increasing health span, not necessarily lifespan. It should be about dealing with this problem that SARS-CoV-2 has massively reminded us of, is that there is a significant portion of people out there who spend a significant part of their life, normally their latter part of their life, with comorbid conditions, most of which are related to the diets and the lifestyles that they're eating. So it is a crazy idea imagining that you need some not yet invented, patented magic bullet that's going to come along and solve that problem. The reality is it is about fundamental change in the way that we live our lives. And yes, it doesn't drive business in the same way, but only if we continually fuel those businesses by taking our hard-earned cash and giving it to them, do those businesses survive. We have more control than a lot of people think just by being more judicious in our healthcare and our food and our dietary and our lifestyle choices.
Very well said. And I don't know that I can add anything to that, but I will try to bring this thing full circle. So I will wrap this up with where we started with, which is Russian literature. So in the novel that I mentioned at the outset, Fathers and Brothers, and I suggest you read it if you like Russian literature, which I do, the character of Bazarov is a nihilist, and he's very inundated with the work of Nietzsche and others. And as you follow this character through the novel, you come to the realization, which is why this is an anti-nihilist novel, that his skepticism, his rejection of authority and norms isn't enough at the end of the day, because he wreaks chaos wherever he goes. So skepticism is a necessary thing. And as I think Ron and Rob, both of you have pointed out, we need to be skeptical. It's imperative that we are skeptical, but that's not enough. It's not enough just to be skeptical. And I think that that's oftentimes where we stop in this culture. We turn off that channel. We put down that book. We reject that idea because of where it comes from. And we don't take the next step, which is we need to educate ourselves. If it's one thing to reject something else, but you got to fill that void with something else. And you have to be open-minded enough to step outside the paradigm that you're currently stuck in, and realize that we're all stuck in those paradigms. So I applaud this book. I think it raises some really, really interesting questions about the paradigm that we're all stuck in. And we don't realize how much we're being programmed every day through media and other channels to accept that paradigm. So we need to be skeptical of it, but that's not enough. As Rob said, we have to fill that with something else. Education. This pandemic would not be as big a deal if we were healthier. That's just a fact. And both sides should be able to agree with that. So we need to fill that with education on how to empower ourselves. And as Rob said, this isn't an answer that's going to come from above, from authority. This is something that we have to take ownership of. We have to be the authorities of our own health and the authorities of our own education. So I will leave you with that rather convoluted thought. And I will encourage each of you to visit the wonderful publications of Intelligent Medicine. Please tune into Ron's radio show. A&H International, always Rob writes these really in-depth, unbelievably educated exposés on a diversity of different topics that can help you with that process. That can help you be a better consumer of your health. So, gentlemen, I'd like to thank you both for being with us today, and I'd like to thank our audience for joining us as well.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you so much, Tim.
Signing off. Adios.